Just about? Okay, great. As I was driving up yesterday, I was thinking in the car, this is probably the first time there's been a panel, an academic conference dedicated to Austin Spare. I found myself wondering what he might think of that. I also gave some thought to why perhaps that might be. Why is it that academia has passed over Spare for so long? He is, after all, probably, or arguably, the most famous occult artist we have in the UK. And I think there might be a number of reasons for that. First of all is a lack of primary sources. Before 1949, there is actually very little documentation left by Spare. We have very few archives of letters. He left no diaries, no sketchbooks, no sketchbooks of his progress with his writing. And in fact, there is actually no sort of working notes at all concerning how he actually developed his theories and his sorcery. What we do have is 5 published books. And those books in themselves present some problems for researchers. They are, well, it's fair to say that English wasn't Spare's forte. And they're quite complex in the way they're structured. And also there's a difficulty over terms. Sometimes one term has several meanings over a period of time. On other occasions, one meaning has several terms. So I think the tendency to want to look for a pattern or a sort of sense of order in his work has caused difficulties. There's also another difficulty in looking at Spare. This is Spare in the early 1950s, and this is the Spare of Kenneth Grant. Now, Kenneth Grant was an occultist. He had connections with Crowley, and in 1949 he was introduced to Spare by his wife, Steffi Grant. Grant and Spare got on extremely well. They had a very similar worldview, they had an interest in art, they shared interest in occult art, and they began to work together. And the problem with that was that Spare was all too ready to sort of respond to Crowley's own interests. And so we find there's a sort of contamination of ideas. It's very difficult to see where Spare is simply responding to what Grant wanted, or where Grant was responding to what Spare, historically had an interest in. There's also a further issue in that Grant was something of a revisionist. And he created through his Typhonian trilogies a sort of meta-narrative of occult history, if you like, which is something I think Alistair Coombs is doing a talk on Kenneth tomorrow, which I think is going to be fascinating. So Kenneth creates this meta-narrative, and his tendency was to sort of weave in sort of anecdotes and sort of different perspectives on Spare's work, which aren't necessarily Spare's own. This is also quite problematic. In fact, it's so problematic that since then there's been a great deal of confusion between what terms have originated with Spare and which terms originated with Grant, to the extent that it's actually infiltrated academic studies. And I think that Simon Magus wrote a paper which is, I think, is it up on Academia EDU, Simon? Yeah, in which he kind of addresses this problem. Now, I think it's interesting this panel has come about because there have been the discovery of 2 new primary sources, the tarot deck, and as you'll see, a working folio, which forms part of my discussion. The question I'm asking really is, how is it that Grant has presented Spare, which has caused so many problems? Well, Grant presents Spare as part of a witch lineage. Apparently Spare met this witch when he was very, very young, Witch Patterson, and she initiated him into witch mysteries. Grant also posits Spare as ontology as being formed of will, desire and belief. And he posits Spare as engaging with something called the Zos and the Kier. Well, the problems with that is that prior to 1949 there is actually almost no evidence that Spare had a significant interest in witchcraft, certainly nothing which is substantial enough to think he was a foundation of any kind of magical interest. I mean, there are occasional pictures in his work, but nothing substantive. Also, will, desire and belief, Spare barely mentions will, actually, once or twice in the Focus of Life, but again, nothing that really sort of gels. There's Austin the Kia, and Grant posits the Kia as a sort of cosmic feminine, but he has multiple definitions of it, rather like Spare did with the Book of Pleasure when he was having his various terms. He had multiple approaches, always describing, never telling. So too does Grant, and one of the definitions that Grant gives to the Kia is a sort of a cosmic whore, if you like. Now, I detect in this Grant attempts to kind of connect Crowley's work with Spare, you know, the will, the Babylon, etc., etc. So these are the problems that face scholarship on Spare now, the lack of primary sources and this sort of revisionist, dominant revisionist idea of Spare's work. So I guess the question we must ask ourselves is, well, what was really going on? What was Spare really interested in? And I'm going to borrow a punchline from the comedian Dave Allen here, which is that if I'm going there, I wouldn't start from here. I'm going to start from here. This is Spare in 1905. He was living with his parents in Kennington Park Gardens in a small, well, quite a large house, but his studio at the top was quite small. He used to beaver away in the evenings doing drawings. And he was a very, very shy boy, apparently quite internal, didn't mix even with his family very, very much. But he was clearly talented and gifted. And a drawing he'd executed a few years before was chosen and hung in the Royal Academy summer show. This caused a press sensation. Suddenly, Spare was besieged by journalists. They were camped at his door. They wanted to interview him. The youngest ever exhibitor at the Royal Academy, they said. Actually, that wasn't quite true, but that's the story they were putting forward. And Spare panicked. He didn't really want to have any involvement with it. And because he didn't mix with the journalists, because he didn't actually have a conversation with them, they did what journalists sometimes do, which is they started making things up. They decided that Spare was going to be president of the Royal Academy, that he was going to be the greatest portraitist of his age, etc., etc., etc. And Spare clearly had a problem with this, but he wasn't really interested in any of that. What he was interested in is this. What is this? It's half dead, it's half alive, it's some strange sort of biomorphic mass. It's actually a drawing dated 1903, and helpfully for us, Spare has titled it Kia Sat. And what is that? Well, Kia was the name that Spare gave to the Absolute. And I guess the best way of interpreting it is through the lens of Taoism, if you like. Kia is Tao, and certainly in its maternal, creative aspect. And this is the earliest expression of it. And Spare saw this as manifest in living things, in nature, in the fecundity of nature. Now, the journalists weren't interested in that. And Spare felt he had to issue some kind of manifesto. And this is the manifesto he issued, Earth Inferno. Now, as you can guess from the title, it's based quite heavily on Dante's Inferno, because for Spare, well, he sort of inverted it, really, because for him, the world he was living in was living hell. And why was it living hell? Because it couldn't allow him to be the person he wanted to be. This is a portrait, self-portrait, in the book. And he says, of myself, strange images of myself did I create as I gazed into the seeming pit of others, losing myself in the thoughtfulness of my unreal self as humanity saw me. But alas, on entering the consciousness of my real being to find fostering the all-prevailing woman, and I strayed with her into the path direct. Hail, the jewel in the lotus. And you can see Spare here wearing what I call his Kia pajamas. You can see there's a little kind of skull motif on them. And he's standing before this woman, which I think is quite important. You'll see why in due course. And this double-page spread, I think, is extremely important for understanding Spare's entire ontology, actually. The Creed of Despair. My ambition is dead, died premature, and with it the love of care. Also the jewel in the lotus. The morrow hoards naught for me, save sin and death. I am even exempt from my own creative pleasures. He was such a goth, wasn't he? Yeah. The barrenness of this life but remains, yet in despair we begin to see true light. Amen. In weakness we can become strong. I'll just go back to that line, yet in despair we begin to see the true light. Amen. And the drawing opposite is called The Despair. And in it we see a self-portrait of Spare. is turned sideways to us, wearing an overcoat, and then next to it, another self-portrait, this time as a woman. Now, bear in mind, this is 1905. This is a 17-year-old boy depicting himself as a woman in a published work. But let's go back to this line again. And yet in despair begin to see the true light. Amen. Well, Amen was also an Egyptian god, Amen, the hidden god. And he was associated with the creation of things. He was a great creator, if you like. And this is the first time it really occurs in Spare's work. Spare helpfully gives us a little synopsis of Earth Inferno. And in it we see the Kia bird again, the sort of skull. It is sort of morphed into a vulture at this point. And I think it's significant that the vulture was the symbol of Mut, who was the consort of Amen in the Egyptian pantheon. But also take a look at these little amoeba we have going around, these single-cell creatures. As you'll see this develops, you'll see how significant these are. Now, Jonathan mentioned Sylvia Pankhurst, and I thought I'd throw this slide in as a slight aside, because it's, I think, important. Here Spare says, we've got a nude lying on a parapet, and Spare says, the desertion of the universal woman, lying barren on the parapet of the subconsciousness in humanity, and humanity sinking into the pit of conventionality. Hail, the convention of the age is nearing its limit, and with it the resurrection of the primitive woman. I wonder what he means by that. I don't think this has really had any proper scholarly interest in it, but it's my sentiment that the universal woman is actually a reference to Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, sometimes also called the universal man. And I think he's making a reference here about an idealized type of woman. When you begin to see it in that light, you begin to see that this is actually quite a political drawing. Spare is aligning himself with the suffragette movement, and in particular in body politic, in terms of the way that society wanted or expected women to be represented. And he is calling here for the resurrection of something more primitive. Now, of course, Kenneth Grant has sexualized the primitive woman into some kind of whore, which I think has deflected the true message which is being given here. Now, following years, Spare begins to develop these themes. This is a manuscript called The Focus of Life, the Papyrus of Amen AOS. And we see that word Amen is now connected with Spare himself, Amen AOS. We see this sorcerer here with this Kia bird emerging from this board, tethered. Some hope, I think, of that. And this manuscript is full of the most extraordinary drawings of living things. Birds, reptiles, quadrupeds of all kinds, fish, and sometimes you can see the line is actually so frenzied, he's actually not drawing anything at all. He's just really reflecting the exuberance of life itself, that kind of energy which is being pushed forward. Now, at the end of the book, there is a drawing, a self-portrait called The Ascension of Amen AOS. And we see Spare there again with like a halo, was Christ-like in a way, and the Kia bird rising up before him. And you see Spare discarding a mask of conventionality. Now, a couple of years later, Spare issued the Book of Satires. Now, this is a very political book. It's mostly drawings. It's quite a Hogarthian critique on modern society. But there's one drawing in it which I'd like to take a look at. This one here, called the General Allegory. We see here a more mature artist, and he's fixed, staring straight at us. And behind him there's this immense masculine woman. And off to their right there are a series of masks hanging. And I presume that Spare, being older and interacting with society in different ways, had to have various masks of conventionality. Now, it was in 1907 that Spare had his show at the Bruton Gallery. And at the Bruton Gallery he met someone called Aleister Crowley. And Crowley was very taken with Spare, and he was a young, good-looking man with great talent. And Crowley persuaded him to sign up as a probationer to his new magical order, the Argentum Astrum. And Spare signed up and took a magical name, Jehovah. Now, Bill Wallace has noted this is a portmanteau of Jehovah and Om. Why might that be? It's my contention that it comes from Blavatsky. The name Jehovah expresses a he and a she, and Om is the original of Amen. So in a sense, this is a hidden he and she, and we know Spare had an interest in Blavatsky. Now, the relationship between Crowley and Spare was very strained. They had very, very different means of approaching magic. I think Spare probably originally took an interest in Crowley because he thought he was the one person in Edwardian London who could probably validate what he was doing, the one person who could actually say, yes, I think you're onto something. Crowley wasn't really about validating others at all. There was a lot of tension between the two, and eventually they parted ways. Later, Crowley was to annotate his enrollment form for the AA as an artist can't understand organisation or would have passed. But the relationship did have fruit. This book, The Book of Pleasure. The Book of Pleasure is considered Spare's magnum opus, and he develops a lot of the ideas that we've seen growing. But it's quite a complicated book because it's very, very dense. And what we see is Spare defining terms in many, many different ways, describing the thing without actually saying what it is. Even when he does say what it is, we're none the wiser. Now I think this is actually quite an interesting magical technique in writing. It's almost a sort of conceptual palimpsest where you're continually writing and rewriting to try and create a sense of well, I've argued actually that it bears relation to Geoffrey Harpham's theories of the grotesque, which is that you're creating this interstitial interval of understanding. And I think the Book of Pleasure is actually a great exercise in that. But it's full of the most extraordinary androgynous drawings. This one's called Ascension of the Ego from Ecstasy to Ecstasy. This one called The Instance of Obsession. The Self's Visions of Enlightenment. Now Spare introduces some new ideas in the Book of Pleasure. Now we still have the Kia, of course, that sort of cosmic, fecund, sort of Taoist principle. But we also have the new sexuality, and Spare termed this the ancestral sex principle. He said, time has not changed it, hence I call it new. And then we have the neither I. There are various ways that this has been approached in the Book of Pleasure. I think in summary of it, the best I can say is it's a sort of sense of negated or dissociated self. And then we have self-love. Now, I think Phil Baker makes a comment, this is a sort of narcissism in his biography of Spare. And I think while there's an argument for that, I would say actually I think it's a bit deeper. And I will go on a little bit later to describe that in more detail. And this is actually the first time that Spare mentions Zos with any kind of conviction, but it appears in a tiny drawing where he simply says, Zos, the body considered as a whole. He also introduces us to something called the death posture. Now, when I was originally thinking of doing this talk, I was thinking of doing it entirely on the death posture. I decided not to do that. So I will only just touch upon it here. But it's basically it's a ritual praxis for imitating death. And I think that's quite well covered in esoteric traditions, certainly in Masonry and elsewhere. And this is Spare's version of it, if you like. But Spare also talks about the subconscious quite a lot in the Book of Pleasure. Now, throughout his life, Spare was very, very quick to pick up on new trends and new ideas and incorporate them in his work. It's a very sorcerous attitude, and he did so with the subconsciousness, but he says something quite interesting about it. Know the subconsciousness to be an epitome of all experience and wisdom, past incarnations as men, animals, birds, vegetable life, etc., etc. The last is the almighty simplicity. And he also says, if we succeed in awakening them, we shall gain their properties and our accomplishment will correspond. Well, Spare believed the Book of Pleasure was going to change things for him. He thought it was going to open the door and he would be recognized finally for what he was going to contributing, but it sort of sank without trace. He produced only 300 copies. It's far too dense for most people. And then the year after it was published, the First World War began. Spare ended up being conscripted. He served as an official war artist, and this was cataclysmic for him. His wife, left at home with no money, sold his collection of tribal art and books. Can you imagine? He emerges from the war without a marriage, without anything really in his possession, and without a career. So He sets up in a small apartment close to the British Museum. Now, you would think in this circumstance that Spare, and very, very hard times, would set about perhaps making money of some kind, a sort of a business plan, if you like. He doesn't. He returns to the idea he had in 1905, the focus of life, and he writes to a friend called Frederick Carter, and he says, I'd like to do a book. And they did do a book. Frederick Carter was the editor. The Focus of Life was published in 1921. Now, this is perhaps the most professionally produced of all Spare's books. It's a series of beautiful color-type drawings of nudes. The narrative is full of aphorisms, poetic, dreamlike, quite extraordinary, very readable, quite hard to understand what he's talking about. Quite recently, a couple of years back, there was a discovery of the original conceptual folio which went to produce The Focus of Life. And if you can believe it, since the 1930s, it had been in possession of the novelist E.M. Forster. This is the upper cover. Now note this sort of strange circular being here. Now this concept folio is full of incredible work. Here Spare says, AOS renouncing the past sexuality. It's a very clear statement of purpose. And here we have a mock title page. The Focus of Life, The Mutterings of Eos by Austin Osman Spare. Now I think AAOS is actually Amen AOS, and Spare has contracted the Amen to render it hidden. And we see here again this round circular being in a kind of vast cosmic womb. Now there are a series of 5 drawings in this book which I think underpin Spare's ontology. This is a self-portrait as a woman. Now I've divided these 5 into 2 groups. These 2 look to be pure erotica. I actually think it's more than that. I think Spare is referencing the erotic furies as a means to the reunification of the soul. You can see by the frenzied line. Now these 3 drawings, 3 self-portraits, prior, just before, just after some event. What is that event? In The Focus of Life, Spare makes it, there's a small passage which is buried. Spare says, I assert this self-love to be the most secret ritual, hidden by blasphemous ideographs, and he who calls, pronouncing the word fearlessly, the entire creation of woman shall rush into him. I think these 3 drawings depict, in part, the act of self-love. What is that? Well, we can only speculate because Spare never actually said. My personal sentiment is what we're looking at is a sort of a sleight of mind, if I can put it that way. I think he was able to create a dissociative state where he could be both the giver and the receiver simultaneously. And I think he combined this with, for better words, a sort of form of edging. So he never actually reached orgasm, but he continued, and this created this sort of ecstatic state. Why do this? What is it for? In the Book of Pleasure, there's a passage which is, I think, quite illustrative. It says, a microbe has the power to destroy the world, and certainly would if it took an interest in us. If you were to dismember its limb, the mutilated part would regrow, etc. So by evoking and becoming obsessed or illuminated by these existences, we gain their magical properties or the knowledge of their attainment. And you remember those little amoeba in the Earth Inferno at the beginning? Well, this is a drawing from the conceptual folio. It says, AOS destroying cosmos. And this is the frontispiece to the Focus of Life, the finished book. And you can see Spare standing there, this great solar motif behind him, the logos of the book over his genitals. He shared with his friend Frank Ledgeford later that when he posed for the photograph, the basis of this image, the flash was so bright it singed his pubic hair. Actually, I think this is referencing Jura, the resurrection of Christ. And I think also there's an alchemical element to it. So, in conclusion, these new primary sources are adding to a continuing critique of Grant's reading of Spare. I think that this is very important to get past this kind of worldview that we have. It's very clear that the early influences were not witchcraft at all, but classical ideas surrounding the unification of the soul. And I was very interested to see Sasha's talk earlier in her acknowledging Peladan's interest in Plato, because it's quite clear to me that Plato was one of those classical sources. We've got the erotic furies, we've got the round circular being, the original androgynous being, and we've got the sense of the reunification of the soul. And his approach to this, including evoking latent memories through associative states, the neither, neither, I think Spare was hoping that if he could mimic these properties, these androgynous properties, he could become, well, he could evoke the memory of the first cell on Earth, the cell from which all life is evolved. I think it's an extraordinary notion that the one thing that connects each and every one of us in this room is we have that commonality. We all stem from that first moment of creation. And I think Spare was hoping that by retracing, going back through the subconscious and awakening these strata of memory, the memory of the first single cell, that he could command its power and effectively all this creative energy and channel it into his art. As I say, Spare regard this as a means to magical and creative empowerment. Thanks very much. I'm going to add, I added a little code R. I forgot I added a code R. The Focus of Life has a dedication dedicated to LCOCS, Vestigial Retrorsum. And this dedications can cause a great deal of speculation over the years. I'm going to throw something onto the table. This was published in March 1920 in Francis Picaber's Journal 391, Paris. Now we cannot know for certain if Spare saw it, but I do think that Spare's tendency to borrow quite heavily from others is not without note here. And of course, LCOCS, there's a sense that perhaps it might be an Irish name, OCS or something. I think it might be French actually, and I think Spare was trying to imitate Duchamp. I'll say OCS. She knows and is. I can't think of a better dedication to a cosmic feminine absolute. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Questions for Robert?
More of a comment than a question in a way. Just what you went into with the Spare using Amen as a magical name triggered something for me, because I'd been, especially in relation to the androgyny or hermaphroditic aspect in his work, because I'd already got into this thing of the Kia being related to Mut with the symbol of the vulture, but realizing the Amen or Amun aspect, that the bar in ancient Egypt, as well as being the soul, was also a pun apparently for the sound of the ram, so was also related to Amun, the ram or goat-headed god. And the combined form of Amun and Mut, who were consorts in Luxor, is actually that of Baphomet, who Spare also drew. Because you've got the bar for Mut, and fo is of in ancient Egyptian. And I saw in the Valley of the Kings an image of Amun and Mut conjoined in one form, but it was only their zootypes. So it was just the vulture wings, the big black wings, and the ram, the horned head. But if you actually put their human aspects in as well, male and female bodies, you have a complete image of Baphomet as was later seen. So the fact that he also used this name Amen as well as the symbol of the vulture, I think, is quite significant in that way.
I wish Spare had done a Baphomet series. That would have rocked. He didn't. But thanks for the observation, Ariel.
He did do that image in Images and Oracles.
Just the one.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Other question?
Thank you, Robert. Wonderful talk. Really very, very interesting. I've learned a lot, and I've never looked too deeply into Spare, so many things were new for me. I was wondering, Earth Inferno. Inferno, I think it's clear, it's obvious, it's natural to think about Dante, but I was thinking whether it would be possible perhaps to look elsewhere also, and I was thinking about another kind of lineage which would go from Swedenborg through William Blake up to Strindberg. I think William Blake probably offers a kind of model also to many British artists who are interested in the occult, in esotericism, in alternative spirituality. And this is something that, to my knowledge, has not been researched enough. There is so much that could be said. So I was wondering whether you think there is something about that, also knowing that in this tradition, coming from originally from Swedenborg, there is also another take on this problem of the unification of the soul, which is extremely sexualized. So maybe there is something there which might be interesting. And secondly, what is the origin of this term Kia? Because I was thinking, maybe it has something to do with Gaia, the Greek name for earth, for the goddess of earth. The sound perhaps is similar, and after all, the title of the book was Earth Inferno.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so in two parts. I think with Spare's work, when I'm looking at it, I'm trying to think of the kind of resources that he would have had and the kind of influences he would have had as a young man in Edwardian England. I think, without question, in terms of Dante's Inferno, the biggest influence would have been Gustave Doré's illustrated edition, which I think was in print for a period of 50 or 60 years, from the 1860s through to about 1910. Certainly in terms of its imagery and its grotesque dark qualities, you see that evident in Spare's work. I think in terms of Blake, the Blake revival was just getting into motion around 1904 through Graham Robertson, who was promoting him quite heavily. There's some evidence to suggest that Spare had an interest in Blake. It's difficult to see how much of an influence that was from what we have evident extant at the moment. The second question about Kia, God, I wish I could answer that. I really do. In 30 years, I've not found any answer which I think is, has sufficient gravitas to lend it to be the answer. There's certainly a number of different ways one can approach it. Spare was incredibly acquisitive as an artist, but he tended to kind of change things around when he borrowed them. He tended to sort of move things and to try and make it his own in a way. Whether Kia is a direct copy of a word, or whether it's a word which has been reversed, whether it is something which he's translated and he's changed the translation in some way, we don't know, is the answer. I mean, Blavatsky's work, I think there is some mention of Kia in a name, but it doesn't lend any credibility to be the foundation of, you know, something of this import.
what about the possibility that it is related
To Gia?
Yeah?
It's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. I wouldn't know to what degree that was within Spare's orbit at that time. I would have to check the contemporary source to see how likely he would have found it in Newington Library, for example, which was his source for most things at that time. But I think it's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Hi there, thank you, that was awesome. I found myself, I think my question is about sort of ideas around the time that Spare might have been drawing on, or his conceptions of a universal feminine. When I think of my readings on theosophy and those circles around suffragettes, the universal feminine, the late Victorian, this very glorified, almost a non-physical universal feminine, you know, something that doesn't have a body, that doesn't bleed, that doesn't have leg hair, all those things that come with the very, you know, with the corporality. And he has that. You know, he has it in the male body, has it in the female body. And I just wondered if you've, you know, over the years had reflections on his idea about the universal feminine. He's just so, I don't know, yeah. That's a really shit question, I'm sorry about that. But yeah, Spare in the universal feminine and the physicality of the body.
Are you talking in a political sense, or are you talking in a spiritual sense? Or?
I think of anybody on the planet, you are the person who is closest to being inside Spare's head. And so my question is really like, if you, as much as you commune with Spare, how does it feel to you like that was for him?
Okay, well, I think probably he would have been quite naive to those kind of issues until he met with Sylvia Pankhurst and the crew at the Royal College of Art. And then I think probably, to curry favour with them, he was interested in what they were interested in. And I think that their thoughts would have probably influenced him. That seems to be the most likely way it would have panned out. He certainly was, his interest was with Sylvia Pankhurst was prolonged. In fact, just after the Second World War, she petitioned to the government for a civil pension for him, unsuccessfully. So they clearly were in contact for a long time, and the friendship was very genuine. You know, again, I'm sort of hand-tied slightly by the lack of primary sources. I would love to be able to say, you know, we had a significant female correspondent from Spare dating from 1905 through to 1920, where I could actually say, yes, this was his approach. We don't have that. So it's speculation until something appears, you know, unfortunately.
Okay, that's good. It gives us about 5 minutes before Patricia's keynote. So thank you.
Thanks.